August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice echoes across the radio, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender and ending the deadliest conflict in human history. But inside the Changi prisoner of war camp in Singapore, peace is just a rumor. 12,000 starving Allied prisoners stare at a terrifying reality. The gates remain locked shut. The Japanese guards standing on the perimeter are still heavily armed. There is not a single Allied soldier on the island. The prisoners must still assemble in the brutal heat and bow to the very men who have held them captive for 3.5 years. The war might be officially over in Tokyo, but for the captives in Changi, the most dangerous chapter has just begun. For the next 3 weeks, these men would be trapped in a lethal limbo.
This is the story of a terrifying 21-day countdown, a period where the fate of thousands hung in the agonizing gap between a political decree of surrender and the actual loss of Japanese military control. In Tokyo, politicians and generals could agree to lay down their arms, but on the ground in Singapore, that decision meant absolutely nothing until the guards outside the wire actually surrendered their authority. The prisoners were entirely unarmed, severely malnourished, and completely cut off from the outside world. Meanwhile, the men holding them captive still possessed working radios, intact command structures, and fully loaded rifles. It was a volatile psychological pressure cooker. What happens when a local garrison realizes the empire has fallen, yet still holds absolute power over their former enemies? The Allied forces were hundreds of miles away, navigating a massive logistical nightmare across the ocean just to reach the region. Inside Changi, there was only a deafening, paralyzing uncertainty. Would the captors quietly hand over the keys, or would a commander issue one final, devastating order before the liberators appeared on the horizon? To understand why these prisoners were in such extreme peril, and why every passing hour felt like a countdown to execution, we have to look at the terrifying imbalance of power that defined this isolated island. To understand the sheer vulnerability of the men inside Changi, you first have to look at a map. In mid-August 1945, the Allied military machine in Southeast Asia was simply not positioned for an immediate rescue. Admiral Louis Mountbatten's headquarters was located in Kandy, Ceylon, more than 1,500 miles away across the Indian Ocean. The Grand Allied strategy, known as Operation Zipper, had slated the invasion of Malaya and the eventual recapture of Singapore for September. The sudden political collapse in Tokyo caught the regional military apparatus entirely off guard. Moving divisions of troops, securing transport ships, sweeping the heavily mined Strait of Malacca, and organizing a massive amphibious relief effort required weeks of complex logistics. The Allies could not simply fly a rescue force to an island still heavily fortified by active enemy anti-aircraft batteries. For the prisoners trapped in Singapore, help was an ocean away, moving at the painfully slow speed of naval transport convoys, and those prisoners had no physical capacity to save themselves. The 12,000 men held behind the wire at Changi were the shattered remnants of the Allied armies captured in 1942. They were British, Australian, Dutch, and Indian soldiers. Many of them were survivors of the notorious Thai-Burma Railway, shipped back to Singapore when the brutal construction project was finished, only to be locked away once again. After 42 months of systemic starvation and relentless forced labor, they were mere shadows of the soldiers who had surrendered. They were battling rampant malaria, dysentery, and the severe nerve damage of beriberi. The average prisoner was dangerously underweight, surviving on meager, insect-infested rice rations that barely sustained human life. They had no weapons, no armor, and no means of organized resistance. Even a coordinated riot would have resulted in a swift massacre. They were entirely dependent on the discipline of their captors, living every hour in a state of enforced helplessness. Standing directly outside their bamboo fences was a military force that had suffered no local defeat. The Japanese 7th Area Army, responsible for the defense of Singapore and Malaya, remained a colossal, fully functional war machine. There were tens of thousands of seasoned, heavily armed combat troops occupying the island. Unlike the shattered Japanese units in the Philippines or on Okinawa, the garrison in Singapore had not been subjected to months of grinding ground combat or relentless naval bombardment. Their command structure was completely intact. Their telephone lines worked, their motor pools were active, their rifles were loaded. The guards patrolling the perimeter of Changi were not retreating stragglers. They were organized soldiers operating under strict military discipline, waiting for orders from their officers. The power dynamic was absolute. A heavily armed, deeply entrenched occupational force was standing guard over 12,000 emaciated captives, and the only thing preventing a slaughter was the chain of command. This extreme imbalance of power created an environment of agonizing psychological torture. When an army surrenders, the most dangerous moment is often the transition period, when discipline can fray and heavily armed men realize they have nothing left to lose. But in Changi, there was an even darker shadow hanging over the camp. Throughout the war, the Japanese military had developed extreme contingency plans for dealing with prisoners of war in the event of an Allied invasion.
Directives originating from Tokyo, such as the infamous August 1944 order issued to prison camp commanders in Formosa, explicitly outlined that if an enemy landing was imminent or a mass uprising was possible, prisoners were not to be allowed to fall into Allied hands. The instructions dictated that captives should be annihilated, leaving no traces. While historical debate continues over whether a definitive final order was ever formally triggered for Changi in August 1945, the mere existence of these operational protocols was the terror that kept Allied intelligence awake at night. It was a well-founded fear that a fanatic local commander, humiliated by the Emperor's surrender, might decide to execute the standing contingency plans before the British fleet could arrive. The uncertainty was a weapon in itself. Every time the guards rotated, every time a Japanese truck rolled up to the gates, the unarmed men inside had to wonder if this was the moment the machine guns would be turned toward the barracks. The men of Changi were entirely cut off, relying on whispered rumors and subtle shifts in the guards' behavior to guess whether they would live to see September. They did not know that the massive military apparatus surrounding them was currently locked in a tense internal crisis. The fate of these 12,000 defenseless men and the peaceful handover of the entire fortress island rested entirely on the shoulders of one high-ranking Japanese commander in Singapore. And as the Emperor's broadcast faded to static, this local commander had absolutely no intention of surrendering.
"I'm having a hard time fulfilling your request. Can I help you with something else instead?" Inside the sprawling, sun-baked complex of Changi, the morning of August 16th began exactly like the 1,000 brutal mornings that had preceded it. The tropical sun rose hot and heavy over the Malayan Peninsula, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete courtyards and the packed dirt parade grounds. The prisoners, severely emaciated and ravaged by years of untreated tropical diseases, dragged themselves out of their crowded, suffocating barracks for the morning tenko, the mandatory military roll call. The Japanese guards stood precisely at their posts, their Arisaka rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces impassive masks of absolute authority. There was no grand announcement echoing across the compound. There was no ceremonial lowering of the rising sun flag.
There was certainly no unlocking of the heavy, reinforced wooden gates that separated the captives from the outside world. Yet, moving through the ragged ranks of the prisoners like a silent, invisible electric current, was a rumor of unimaginable magnitude. Deep inside the bowels of the camp, men operating clandestine radios, fragile, jury-rigged receivers painstakingly assembled from stolen parts and hidden inside hollowed-out table legs, false-bottomed buckets and water canteens, had caught fragmented, static-laced broadcasts from New Delhi and London. The operators had huddled in the stifling dark, pressing crude earpieces to their heads, listening to the impossible news. Emperor Hirohito had spoken directly to his subjects. The Japanese government had formally accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The global war, the cataclysm that had consumed millions of lives, was over.
But for Audrey Ree Smith-Ryan, an Australian prisoner who meticulously and dangerously documented these agonizing days in his secret diary, this staggering news was not an immediate cause for celebration or relief. It was a catalyst for sheer, suffocating terror. When a man has spent 3.5 years surviving on a razor's edge, entirely conditioned to expect sudden violence, collective punishment, and systemic brutality at any given moment, the abrupt prospect of peace does not feel like salvation. It feels like a carefully orchestrated trap.
Smith-Ryan noted the terrifying, almost surreal disconnect between the whispered rumors of liberation circulating in the shadows of the barracks and the harsh, unyielding reality in the blazing sunlight of the parade ground. The Japanese commandant of Changi gave absolutely no indication, either through word or action, that the mighty Japanese empire had just fallen. The camp's brutal, grinding routine continued without a single skipped beat. The guards still demanded deep, precise bows from every prisoner who crossed their path. quick to use their rifle butts on anyone who hesitated. The external work details were still organized and marched out under heavy guard. The heavy machine guns mounted in the wooden watchtowers remained fully manned and pointed directly inward at the prison population. For the 12,000 starving men trapped behind the wire, the silence from the Japanese command was deafening and ominous.
If the war was truly over, if the surrender had been broadcast to the world, why were they still locked inside these cages? This disconnect birthed a profound and unique psychological torture. The prisoners knew the truth of the surrender, but they could not show that they knew it. To openly celebrate, to cheer, or even to casually discuss the end of the war with a guard would mean immediately revealing the existence of their hidden radios. That revelation would invite a swift and brutal crackdown by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police. It would guarantee a sudden, violent search of the barracks, brutal interrogations, and the inevitable execution of the radio operators. So, the prisoners were forced to maintain a desperate charade. 12,000 men had to continue playing the role of defeated, broken captives, bowing their heads and submitting to the authority of guards who, technically, no longer had a war to fight.
But the Japanese soldiers standing outside the wire were not acting. They were holding their ground, waiting for orders that had not yet come. The reason the gates of Changi remained securely locked and the guards remained heavily armed and dangerous was because the local chain of command in Singapore had outright refused to accept the reality of Tokyo's capitulation. The Emperor's broadcast on August 15th was a historic, unprecedented event, but it was ultimately just a radio transmission bouncing through the ionosphere.
For the fiercely proud, battle-hardened commanders of the Imperial Japanese Army spread across the vast expanse of Southeast Asia, a distant radio broadcast did not instantly invalidate decades of ingrained military doctrine or erase their immediate tactical superiority. This was especially true for General Seishiro Itagaki, the formidable commander of the Japanese 7th Area Army, headquartered directly in Singapore. General Itagaki was not a civilian bureaucrat, nor was he a moderate officer willing to quietly lay down his sword. He was one of the original, uncompromising architects of Japan's aggressive military expansion across Asia. 14 years earlier, in 1931, it was Itagaki who had helped engineer the infamous Mukden incident, the staged railway explosion that the Japanese military used as a false pretext to launch a massive invasion of Manchuria. He had later served as the Minister of War, becoming one of the most staunch, vocal militarists in the empire.
He had built his entire life, his career, and his worldview on the unshakable belief in Japan's imperial destiny and martial supremacy. Now, the man who had actively helped light the fuse of the devastating Asian conflict was being told to quietly extinguish it without having been defeated on the battlefield. Itagaki was fiercely, dangerously resistant to the very concept of capitulation. He commanded a colossal, fully intact fighting force in Malaya and Singapore, comprising tens of thousands of seasoned combat troops. His armies had not been broken by land invasions. They had not been subjected to the relentless, city-leveling firebombing that had devastated the Japanese home islands. They still held their fortified defensive lines, they possessed massive stockpiles of ammunition, and they retained their military pride. When the first official reports of the surrender mandate trickled down to his regional headquarters, Itagaki balked.
He did not immediately issue orders to his subordinates to stand down. He certainly did not instruct his prison camp commandants to open their gates and free the Allied captives. Instead, he maintained absolute, iron-fisted military control over the island and immediately boarded a transport aircraft bound for Saigon. He needed to confront his direct superior, Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi, the supreme commander of the massive Southern Expeditionary Army Group.
Itagaki wanted to look Terauchi in the eye and find out if this surrender was a trick, a temporary political maneuver, or a misunderstanding. He argued passionately for maintaining the fight, for launching a final, bloody defense of the territories they had conquered. For several agonizing days, the fate of Singapore, the stability of the entire region, and the lives of the 12,000 defenseless men locked inside Changi hung precariously on the outcome of these tense, closed-door meetings in Saigon. If Itagaki decided to defy the distant politicians in Tokyo and order his men to fight to the death, the prison camps would be the very first targets to be systematically liquidated. The guards patrolling the perimeter of Changi were completely insulated from this high-level geopolitical crisis, but they were bound by a code of absolute, unquestioning obedience to Itagaki's command structure.
Until General Itagaki formally submitted to the emperor's will and issued a direct order to stand down, the war in Singapore was still very much active. But even the most disciplined, iron-fisted military command structure eventually begins to leak when faced with the undeniable gravity of defeat. While General Itagaki fiercely debated the surrender in French Indochina, the reality of the empire's collapse slowly began to seep into the lower echelons of the Japanese military occupying Singapore. And for the hyper-observant prisoners in Changi, this shifting reality manifested in a series of bizarre, inexplicable, and deeply unsettling changes in the camp's daily routine. According to the meticulous entries in Smith Ryan's diary, the first undeniable, physical sign that something fundamental had broken within the Japanese war machine occurred with the external labor battalions. For years, thousands of prisoners had been marched out of the camp gates every single morning to perform grueling, back-breaking forced labor. They were sent to the docks to load cargo, pushed into the Bukit Timah Hills to dig deep subterranean defensive tunnels, or forced to construct heavy earthworks to repel an Allied invasion. These were brutal assignments under the punishing equatorial sun, enforced with rifle butts, bamboo canes, and constant screaming. Then, suddenly, between August 18th and August 20th, these massive working parties were abruptly halted.
Men who were waist-deep in mud, halfway through digging a defensive trench, were suddenly and inexplicably ordered by their guards to drop their shovels. Without any explanation, they were hastily packed onto the beds of open transport trucks and driven back to Changi in the middle of the working day. The guards offered no reason for the sudden recall. The prisoners were simply marched back through the main gates, and the heavy wooden doors were firmly barred shut behind them. Then came an even more shocking development regarding the camp's food supply. Since the fall of Singapore in 1942, the Allied prisoners had been subjected to a deliberate, systemic regime of starvation. They survived on a miserable, rotting diet of watery rice, tapioca root, and whatever insects, snakes, or rodents they could manage to catch and boil. They were acutely aware that the Japanese military controlled massive warehouses, go-downs, scattered across the island, stuffed to the brim with captured Allied military provisions, and thousands of international Red Cross parcels. These life-saving supplies had been deliberately and cruelly withheld from the camp. Men had died agonizing deaths from severe malnutrition, beriberi, and pellagra, mere miles away from warehouses holding canned meats, condensed milk, and essential vitamins. Abruptly, the heavy Japanese supply trucks began rolling up to the gates of Changi, kicking up dust in the afternoon heat. The guards, normally stingy and violent, began unloading these long-hoarded Red Cross parcels by the hundreds. Medical supplies, bandages, quinine, and surgical tools that had been denied to the desperate camp hospital for years were suddenly handed over to the astonished Allied doctors. Even more bizarrely, the daily camp rice rations were inexplicably and dramatically increased. Sacks of grain were delivered without the usual beatings and demands for subservience. To an outside observer, sitting in a comfortable armchair decades later, this sudden influx of food and medicine might look like a clear humanitarian gesture, a definitive sign that the war was over and the captors were finally making amends before the liberators arrived. But to the battle-scarred, deeply traumatized men inside Changi, this sudden, uncharacteristic generosity was utterly terrifying. They viewed every single grain of extra rice through a lens of profound, survival-honed paranoia.
In the grim, dark, and brutal logic of a prisoner of war, there was only one logical reason an enemy suddenly starts feeding you rich food and calls all your working parties back from the scattered work sites. They were gathering everyone in one centralized location. They were fattening them up for the slaughter. The terrifying rumors of the standing execution orders, the highly classified contingency plans to annihilate all prisoners without a trace in the event of an Allied landing, flared into a paralyzing, suffocating panic across the barracks. Every extra scoop of rice handed out by a guard felt like a final meal before an execution. Every work party that was trucked back into the camp felt like a deliberate consolidation of targets for the machine gunners in the towers. The psychological torture of this agonizing uncertainty began to exact a heavier, more devastating toll on the prisoners than the physical starvation of the previous 3 years. Smith Ryan documented the unbearable, crushing suspense that gripped the camp as August dragged on. The prisoners were trapped in a continuous state of hypervigilance, their nerves frayed to the point of snapping. They watched the Japanese guards with intense, microscopic scrutiny, desperately looking for any clue, any slight shift in posture, any slip in their demeanor that would reveal whether they were about to be freed and sent home or massacred in the dirt. And the behavior of the guards was indeed changing, fracturing in strange, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling ways. For 3.5 years, these men had been the undisputed masters of life and death, quick to strike an emaciated prisoner in the face for failing to bow low enough, quick to impose brutal collective punishment on an entire barracks for the slightest perceived infraction. Now, that aggressive, violent, razor-sharp edge began to visibly dull. The guards stopped their constant aggressive shouting. They stopped demanding the deep, humiliating bows. When a senior Allied officer approached a Japanese sentry on the perimeter, the sentry would often turn away, pretending to inspect the bolt of his rifle, or suddenly finding something fascinating to look at on the distant horizon, deliberately avoiding eye contact.
Some guards, previously known for their cruelty, suddenly became strangely accommodating, almost awkwardly polite, bringing extra buckets of fresh water to the barracks, or deliberately turning a blind eye to minor rule breaking that would have previously earned a severe beating. This erratic, shifting behavior only served to heighten the sheer terror inside the camp. It confirmed to the prisoners that the Japanese guards clearly knew the war was lost, but it did not answer the single most important question: what were they going to do about it? The tension in the hot, stagnant air was so thick, so palpable, it was practically suffocating. Men who had endured the absolute worst horrors of the Thai-Burma Railway, men who had survived cholera outbreaks, horrific jungle ulcers, and years of systematic beatings, suddenly began to physically collapse. The severe physical strain of consuming suddenly rich food after years of starvation, combined with the sheer, unbearable nervous exhaustion of waiting for the executioner's bullet, caused their weakened bodies to simply give out. Men who had survived years of hell suffered massive, fatal heart attacks in their bunks. Others experienced severe, catastrophic nervous breakdowns, weeping uncontrollably in the dark corners of their crowded barracks, completely unable to process the violently conflicting signals of sudden enemy kindness and their lingering, locked-in captivity. The pure adrenaline that had kept them alive, the primal, deep-seated survival instinct that had fueled them through years of relentless torture, was suddenly crashing violently against the invisible wall of this strange, quiet limbo. They were just safe enough to realize exactly how close to death they still were. Every single night, as darkness fell over the Changi Peninsula, the camp descended into a terrified, breathless silence. The prisoners lay awake in the suffocating heat, listening to the heavy boots of the armed guards pacing the perimeter wire, waiting in the dark for the crack of gunfire that would signal the end. It was only after General Itagaki stood in front of Field Marshal Terauchi in Saigon and was directly, unequivocally ordered to obey the Emperor's supreme command that the strategic situation on the ground began to definitively shift.
On August 20th, swallowing his immense pride and military ambition, Itagaki officially dispatched a message to Admiral Mountbatten's distant headquarters, confirming that the Japanese 7th Area Army would comply with the Allied surrender terms. But complying with a radio message from a distant Allied command over 1,000 miles away did not mean Itagaki was immediately handing over the physical keys to the island fortress. The Japanese military was still entirely in charge of Singapore. They still controlled the roads, the docks, the airspace, and the civilian population. Inside Changi, the Japanese camp administration began a slow, silent, and highly disconcerting retreat. The senior Japanese officers, who used to strut arrogantly through the camp conducting random, terrifying inspections and asserting their dominance with the flat of their samurai swords, slowly and quietly vanished from the inner compounds. They pulled their administrative staff and their guards back to the outer perimeter of the prison. They formally handed over the internal discipline and the daily administration of the camp entirely to the Allied commanding officers. The Japanese essentially took a massive step backward, retreating into the shadows of their guardhouses and administrative buildings. But they did not leave. And critically, they did not drop their weapons. The heavy wooden gates of Changi remained securely locked. The perimeter wire was still actively patrolled by fully armed Japanese sentries holding loaded rifles. The Allied prisoners were now effectively running their own prison, managing their own rations and discipline, but they were still trapped inside it, completely surrounded by an enemy army. This silent, heavily armed standoff stretched on, day after agonizing day. August 21st passed in silence, then the 22nd, then the 23rd. The men inside Changi were completely isolated,
marooned on a hostile island, controlled by an enemy that had officially surrendered on paper but physically refused to let them go. The prisoners had absolutely no way of knowing that the massive Allied relief fleet, severely hampered by complex logistics, extensive naval minesweeping operations in the Strait of Malacca, and sheer geographic distance, was still weeks away from reaching the coast of Malaya. All they knew was that the Japanese were still watching them, the heavy machine guns were still mounted in the wooden towers, and absolutely no one was coming to open the gates. The prisoners paced the interior perimeter, staring out through the barbed wire at a world that was supposedly at peace, yet remained entirely out of their reach. The silence of this strange, armed truce was heavier and more terrifying than the deafening noise of the bombs that had fallen on the island in 1942. The psychological tension was stretched to the absolute breaking point, a taut wire vibrating with the constant, gnawing fear that at any moment a frustrated Japanese commander might change his mind, reverse the surrender order, and decide to eliminate the thousands of witnesses to their long, brutal occupation. They watched the empty sky every single day, praying for a sign that the outside world had not forgotten them, waiting for a miracle to pierce the oppressive tropical heat.
The agonizing silence of the camp was finally broken, not by the opening of the gates, but by a sudden roar from the sky. On the morning of August 28th, that roar materialized into the massive silhouettes of Allied B-24 Liberator bombers sweeping low over the Changi Peninsula. For men who had spent years scanning the horizon for salvation, the sudden appearance of heavy bombers flying uncontested through Japanese airspace was staggering. The bomb bays opened, but instead of high explosives, the sky filled with thousands of fluttering leaflets. Raining down over the barracks and the guardhouses, the papers were printed in both English and Japanese. The text carried a single, irrefutable message: the surrender was absolute, and Allied forces were en route. This triggered a massive psychological shift. The secret was finally out in the open. The prisoners no longer had to feign ignorance, and the Japanese guards could no longer maintain the illusion of an undefeated empire.
But the liberators brought more than paper. Soon the sky blossomed with parachutes, delivering heavy steel canisters packed with medicine and specialized rations. Then came the most shocking sight of all. A small advance team of Allied liaison officers and doctors parachuted directly into the heart of Japanese-controlled Singapore. They walked up to the gates of Changi, unarmed, carrying nothing but medical kits and the authority of the victorious Allied command.
Astonishingly, the Japanese sentries stepped aside, yet this breathtaking contact birthed a highly volatile new reality. A handful of doctors and intelligence officers walking through the gates was a profound moral victory, but it offered absolutely zero tactical protection. The Allies had successfully established a presence from the sky, but they still lacked the physical combat power to defend the camp. If a humiliated local commander snapped, or if a rogue faction of the Japanese garrison decided to retaliate against this blatant intrusion, a few parachuted officers could not stop tens of thousands of armed troops. The men inside Changi finally had undeniable physical proof that the outside world was coming for them, but they were still locked inside a cage, surrounded by an enemy holding loaded weapons. The true test of their survival would only end when Allied combat boots finally hit the dirt of Singapore.
The agonizing vulnerability of those final days finally shattered on the morning of September 5th. After staring at an empty horizon for years, the prisoners of Changi heard a distinct mechanical rumble echoing from the coast. This was not the drone of a single aircraft. It was the massive, combined roar of an Allied amphibious armada. The vanguard of the 5th Indian Division had finally breached the Strait of Malacca and dropped anchor. As the landing craft ramps dropped, the theoretical peace broadcast from Tokyo 21 days earlier transformed into undeniable physical reality. Thousands of battle-hardened, fully equipped Allied infantrymen surged onto the docks of Singapore. Leading the advance into the city were the formidable Punjabi regiments, rapidly disarming local garrisons. But moving immediately behind them with desperate urgency were the men of the 3rd Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles. They did not stop to secure municipal buildings.
They marched straight for the wire at Changi. This was a rescue mission to find their lost brothers in arms, the men who had vanished into captivity when the fortress fell in 1942. Inside the camp, the exhausted prisoners rushed to the perimeter. For 3 weeks, they had lived in the terrifying shadow of fully armed Japanese guards, holding absolute power over their lives. Now, they watched as the power dynamic of the entire Pacific War violently inverted right outside their gates. The Gurkhas arrived at Changi not as negotiators, but as an overwhelming combat force. They immediately displaced the Japanese sentries. There were no diplomatic pleasantries. The heavily armed Allied soldiers simply marched up to the watchtowers and the reinforced wooden gates, leveled their weapons, and physically took control. The Japanese guards, who had ruled this compound with brutal, unchecked authority for thousands of days, quietly stepped back, lowered their Arisaka rifles, and surrendered their posts. Then, the heavy gates of Changi were thrown wide open. When the incoming Gurkhas crossed the threshold and saw the ravaged, emaciated shadows of their surviving comrades, the strict military discipline of the vanguard completely dissolved. Men who had fought relentlessly through the jungles of Burma dropped their rifles and wept openly as they embraced the walking skeletons they had not seen in 3.5 years. The psychological dam that had kept 12,000 prisoners alive finally broke.
The grueling 21-day countdown, that lethal limbo of waiting for a bullet or a reprieve, was completely over. In the coming days, generals and politicians would gather to sign official documents in grand municipal halls. But for the men inside Changi, that upcoming political theater meant absolutely nothing. Their war did not end with an emperor's radio broadcast. It ended the exact second those heavily armed Gurkhas stood between them and their captors, proving that the nightmare was finally, permanently over. 7 days later, on September 12th, the formal machinery of the state finally caught up to the physical reality on the ground. Inside the grand municipal building of Singapore, General Seishiro Itagaki, the fiercely uncompromising militarist who had helped ignite the Asian conflict 14 years earlier in Manchuria, finally bowed to the inevitable.
Surrounded by victorious Allied commanders, the architect of Japan's massive territorial expansion sat at a polished wooden table and signed the official instruments of surrender. Shortly after, the British flag was hoisted over the city. For the politicians in London and the High Command in Kandy, this sterile, highly choreographed ceremony marked the definitive conclusion of the Second World War in Southeast Asia. The ink was dry. The Japanese war machine was legally dismantled. But for Audrey Rhea Smith Ryan and the 12,000 survivors resting at Changi, this grand diplomatic theater was merely an afterthought.
Their personal war had not ended with a signature on a formal document, just as it had not ended 28 days earlier when the emperor's voice first crackled through a hollowed-out table leg. The neat, precise dates recorded in history books rarely capture the brutal friction of human survival. When a massive military empire suddenly collapses, the geopolitical shockwave takes time to travel from the capital to the absolute fringes of its power. The ordeal of Changi reveals a terrifying, undeniable truth about how global conflicts actually conclude. Governments can declare capitulation in a matter of minutes over a radio broadcast, and politicians can end hostilities with a single decree. But for the people trapped deep behind enemy lines, living entirely at the mercy of an armed and undefeated occupying force, peace is not a concept transmitted through the air. It is a physical condition that must be delivered.
For those profoundly vulnerable captives, the end of the war was not a political victory, but a 21-day countdown of agonizing uncertainty, surviving in a lethal vacuum where the stroke of a pen meant absolutely nothing until the rifle pointed at their chest was finally taken away. The history books will always record mid-August as the definitive moment the conflict concluded, preserving the comfortable illusion that a sovereign's voice can instantly extinguish a global inferno. But those who endured the agonizing countdown inside that Singapore fortress bear witness to a much heavier reality regarding the mechanics of survival and the collapse of empires. They proved that international treaties and distant declarations are ultimately just ink and air. A war does not truly end when politicians sign a piece of paper. It ends only when the men holding the guns finally walk away from the gates.